The moment I switched our water glasses and saw pure terror flash across my son's face is something I'll never forget. My name is Eleanor Winters, and at 73, I never imagined I'd catch my only child trying to poison me just weeks after secretly taking out a $2 million life insurance policy on my life. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will show you exactly how to protect yourself from those who might not have your best interests at heart. This photograph was taken just 3 years ago, me celebrating my 70th birthday at my lakeside home. My son Richard stands beside me, arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling. I thought we were a loving family with nothing to hide from each other. I was wrong. Was raised in a small farming community where my father worked as the local doctor. Always observe carefully before making your diagnosis, Ellie, he would say. The most important symptoms are often hiding in plain sight. His wisdom saved my life 50 years later. After my husband Thomas passed away 5 years ago, Richard began visiting more frequently. What seemed like the caring attention of a devoted son gradually revealed itself as something more calculated. His questions about my finances became increasingly detailed, his suggestions about estate planning more insistent. "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" he would ask with practiced casualness. "At your age, it's important to have everything in order." Each question seemed innocent enough alone, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. My first concrete suspicion came when I discovered Richard had been photographing my medication bottles during his visits. I noticed this accidentally while looking through pictures from our family fishing trip. Between shots of the lake were close-ups of my prescription labels. When questioned, he dismissed it as just keeping track in case of emergency. But his expression told a different story. Rather than confronting him directly, I decided to observe more carefully. My father had taught me that proper diagnosis requires patience and evidence. I began keeping detailed notes about Richard's visits and installed a small security camera in my living room disguised within a decorative clock. The pattern quickly became impossible to dismiss. Richard searched through my home office when he thought I was napping. He photographed financial statements. He tested my memory, then expressed exaggerated concern over minor lapses. Most disturbingly, he began suggesting I might need his more direct assistance with financial decisions. "Mom, at your age, managing these assets is becoming too complex," he would suggest, with manufactured concern. "Why don't I help simplify things, put everything in joint accounts so I can handle the complicated matters for you?" Through discreet inquiries with my attorney, I discovered Richard had made multiple appointments seeking information about my estate without my knowledge. He had specifically asked about power of attorney requirements and how to document cognitive decline. My attorney, who had worked with our family for decades, found these inquiries concerning enough to contact me directly. "Eleanor, Richard expressed concerns about your cognitive capacity that don't align with my observations of you," she explained during our confidential lunch. He seemed particularly interested in mechanisms to establish decision-making authority without formal competency hearings. This information transformed vague discomfort into concrete alarm. The evidence suggested he was systematically laying groundwork to gain control of my assets that would eventually become his through normal inheritance, but apparently not quickly enough for his purposes. I developed what I called my protection protocol. I worked with my attorney to create estate documents requiring multiple independent medical evaluations before any change in decision-making authority. I established financial structures that protected core assets from impulsive actions. And I began carefully documenting all interactions with Richard. I confided in 2 trusted individuals, my longtime physician, Dr. Sarah Lewis, and my closest friend Margaret, who lived nearby and could check on me regularly. "Your observations are troubling but not conclusive," Dr. Lewis advised. "Continue monitoring while we establish baseline health documentation that would contradict any false claims." The breakthrough came during Richard's monthly Sunday dinner visit. He arrived bringing expensive wine and a new estate planning book he thought would simplify things for me. As I prepared our meal, he insisted on making tea, bringing it to me with uncharacteristic attentiveness. "Mom, I've been thinking about your future care needs," he began as I noticed the tea had an unusual cloudiness. I found a wonderful assisted living community that would remove all these burdensome responsibilities from your shoulders. When I explained I had no interest in leaving my home of 40 years, his expression flashed with momentary annoyance before returning to practiced concern. At your age, independence isn't always the wisest choice. Accidents happen when seniors live. Alone, I left the tea untouched, noting his repeated glances toward the still full cup. When dinner was served, he volunteered to bring water for both of us, another uncharacteristic act from a son who typically expected to be served during his visits. The water glass he placed before me had a faint cloudiness similar to the tea. More tellingly, he watched with unusual intensity as I raised the glass repeatedly, encouraging me to drink. "You seem dehydrated, Mom. Drink up. It's important at your age to stay properly hydrated." I excused myself to the kitchen and quickly captured a sample of the water in an empty prescription bottle I had prepared based on growing suspicions. Upon returning, I deliberately created a distraction by dropping my napkin, and during the moment Richard bent to retrieve it, I switched our water glasses. The transformation in his behavior was immediate. When I raised what had been his water glass, he suddenly reached out, almost knocking it from my hand. "Wait, don't drink that. I just remembered I put some of my heart medication in that water. Senior moment of my own." I guess he laughed nervously. "Let me get you fresh water." The obvious lie, Richard had no heart condition requiring medication, confirmed my suspicions. My son had placed something in my beverages deliberately with clear intent. "Actually, I'm not very thirsty," I replied calmly, maintaining outward composure while my internal alarm systems escalated. "Tell me more about your recent life insurance policy." The question visibly startled him. "What life insurance policy?" "The one with National Security Life." I continued watching his expression carefully for $2 million on my life taken out 3 months ago, with you as sole beneficiary. The color drained from his face as he realized I had discovered information he had carefully concealed. His expression cycled through shock denial and calculation before settling on defensive indignation. "That's just responsible financial planning, Mom. Every advisor recommends appropriate insurance coverage for estate purposes." "Interesting," I noted calmly, "especially since I already have appropriate coverage arranged through my own planning. Coverage you're well aware of as we discussed it after your father passed. This second policy seems redundant unless its purpose is different." If you've ever had that moment when you realized someone close to you wasn't who you thought they were, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because in part 2 you'll discover exactly what was in that water glass. The shocking conversation. That followed, and the unexpected ally who helped me uncover the full extent of my own son's devastating betrayal. Richard stared at me across the dining table, his practiced composure cracking around the edges as he realized I knew about the life insurance policy he'd hidden from me. The cloudy water glass sat between us, physical evidence of intentions too terrible for a mother to contemplate. If you haven't seen part 1 of this story, I recommend watching it first to understand how I discovered my son had taken out a secret life insurance policy on me and may have been attempting to poison me during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. "Mom, you're completely misunderstanding the situation," Richard insisted, his voice strained with forced casualness. "The policy is just standard estate planning, and that water mix-up was just confusion about my supplements. I'd spent 73 cow years developing the patience to see through deception, and now I was grateful for every lesson life had taught me." "Then you won't mind if I have this water tested?" I replied calmly, holding up the small prescription bottle containing the sample I'd collected. The flash of panic in his eyes confirmed everything. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "You can't possibly think I would." "I don't want to think it," I interrupted, surprising myself with my steady voice despite my breaking heart. "But I've learned to trust evidence over wishes, Richard. My late husband Thomas had always handled confrontations in our family, stepping in to resolve conflicts while I maintained peace. His absence in this moment felt particularly acute, facing our only son across a table where evidence of betrayal sat in plain sight with no buffer between us. But perhaps this was fitting. I needed to handle this situation with clear-eyed determination rather than the emotional compromises Thomas might have made to preserve family harmony. "I've noticed. The pattern for months," I continued. "The unusual interest in my finances, the photographs of my medication, the exaggerated concerns about my cognitive state that you've mentioned to my attorney, my doctor, and several friends. Now a secret life insurance policy and suspicious substances in my beverages. These aren't coincidences." Richard's expression transformed, abandoning pretense as he recognized denial was futile. "You don't understand the financial pressure I'm under," he said, his voice hardening. "The business is failing. Charlotte is threatening divorce if I can't maintain her lifestyle. The kids' college funds are empty." The cold calculation in his tone chilled me more than any angry outburst could have. This wasn't impulsive desperation but methodical planning. My son had been systematically preparing to solve his financial problems through my death. "And your solution was to cash in on my life?" I asked quietly. "Rather than simply asking for help, would you have liquidated your precious investments? Sold this oversized house you refused to leave?" He countered with unexpected bitterness. "You've always chosen your independence over our needs. You and Dad both. So proud of your self-sufficiency while I struggled." This distorted version of our family history revealed how completely Richard had reconstructed reality to justify his actions. The modest support we had provided throughout his adult life, helping with down payments, covering his children's braces and summer camps, when his business had cash flow issues, loaning money for business expansions that were never repaid, had apparently been reframed as inadequate in his mind. "I have helped you, Richard, repeatedly. What I haven't done is sacrifice my security to enable financial decisions that consistently prioritized appearance over substance." The words were difficult but necessary. "That's very different from planning my death for insurance proceeds." His expression hardened further. "You have no proof of anything except prudent financial planning. That water story is your imagination. Who would believe an elderly woman making dramatic accusations against her devoted son who visits faithfully every week, especially a woman whose memory has been increasingly unreliable?" The threat was implicit but clear. If I pursued this, he would escalate claims about my cognitive decline. Claims he had already been establishing with people in my life. It was a calculated gamble that I would back down rather than risk having my independence questioned through manipulated concerns about my mental capacity. What Richard didn't know was that I had anticipated this exact scenario. "Actually, I have considerably more evidence than you realize," I replied, reaching for my phone and opening an app that displayed the security camera feed from the decorative clock, including video of you adding something to my water in the kitchen 20 minutes ago. The color drained from his face as I turned the screen toward him, showing clear footage of his actions. "You've been recording me in your home. That's illegal," he sputtered, grasping for some advantage. "Not in a single-party consent state, and certainly not in my own home where I have reasonable security concerns," I corrected him. "But that's hardly your biggest legal concern right now." I hadn't called the police immediately upon discovering Richard's actions, a mother's hesitation that perhaps revealed lingering blindness where my son was concerned. But I had activated the second phase of my protection protocol the moment I'd confirmed my suspicions about the water. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Richard's head snapped toward the sound alarm, replacing his previous confidence. "That would be Margaret," I explained calmly. "My dear friend, who happens to be a retired toxicologist from the state crime lab, she's here to collect the water sample professionally, maintaining proper chain of custody for potential evidence." This wasn't the impulsive reaction of a confused elderly woman, but the carefully coordinated response I had prepared after weeks of mounting evidence. Margaret had agreed to remain on standby during Richard's visit, ready to implement our evidence collection plan if my suspicions proved warranted. As Margaret entered with her professional kit and formal documentation, Richard's confident facade crumbled entirely. The systematic preparations he discovered facing him reflected planning more thorough than his own, not the panicked reaction of a vulnerable victim, but the methodical response of someone who had anticipated his moves well in advance. "We can handle this privately," he offered urgently, as Margaret efficiently collected the water sample, labeled it, and sealed it in an evidence bag. "There's no need to involve outsiders in a family misunderstanding. Think about how this would affect your grandchildren if it became public." The emotional manipulation might have worked in the past when protecting family harmony had been my primary concern, but the stakes had transformed that priority entirely. "I've already considered that impact," I replied as Margaret completed her documentation. "That's why Dr. Lewis will be conducting a complete toxicology screen on me tomorrow morning, and why my attorney has prepared a full statement detailing the pattern of concerning behaviors I've documented over the past 6 months." Each revelation further dismantled Richard's perceived control of the situation. What he had envisioned as a vulnerable, isolated victim had turned out to be the center of a careful support network of professionals who had been systematically monitoring his actions. "You've been investigating me. Your own son." The genuine shock in his voice revealed how completely he had underestimated me. In his mind, I had remained the mother who overlooked his flaws and made excuses for his failures, not someone capable of clear-eyed assessment of threatening behavior, even from family. "I've been protecting myself while hoping I was wrong," I corrected him. "There's a significant difference." Margaret finished her evidence collection and stood beside me, her presence providing both practical and emotional support. "The sample will be analyzed by tomorrow," she confirmed. "Eleanor, do you want me to stay tonight?" The question addressed the immediate safety concern we had discussed previously, whether I would remain in my home alone after confronting Richard. We had developed multiple contingency plans depending on how the confrontation unfolded. "That won't be necessary," I replied, making a decision based on Richard's defeated demeanor rather than fear. Richard was just leaving, and he won't be returning without prior arrangement and additional people present. My son stared at me with an expression I couldn't fully interpret, some mixture of shock, anger, and perhaps a trace of reluctant respect. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. His carefully constructed plan to exploit perceived vulnerability had collapsed upon discovering I was anything but the passive victim he had anticipated. "This isn't over," he said quietly as he gathered his things. "You're making a terrible mistake." "The mistake was believing you would place my well-being above your financial concerns," I replied. "Everything else is simply consequence." After Richard departed, Margaret helped me secure the house before conducting a thorough check of my medication bottles and food supplies for potential tampering. The necessary precautions felt surreal, implementing security measures against my own child in the home where I had once nursed him through childhood illnesses and celebrated his achievements. "Are you certain you don't want me to stay?" Margaret asked again as we completed our security check. "This has been an enormous shock, Eleanor. No one should be alone after such a discovery." Her concern was warranted, but unnecessary. "I've actually been preparing for this possibility for weeks," I explained. The shock came gradually with each piece of evidence I couldn't explain away. Tonight was confirmation, not revelation. After Margaret left with the samples, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by photographs spanning decades of family history. Richard's graduation, his wedding, the births of my grandchildren. The contrast between those captured moments of apparent family unity and the reality I now faced created a dissonance almost physically painful to contemplate. If you've ever had to face a betrayal so fundamental, it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about someone you love. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell because in Part 3, you'll discover the shocking results of the water analysis, the unexpected alliance that formed to protect me when Richard escalated his efforts in ways I never anticipated, and how decades-old wisdom from my father ultimately provided the key to resolving a situation I never imagined facing in my 70s. The laboratory results arrived exactly 48 hours after Margaret had collected the water sample from my dining room table. As I sat in Dr. Lewis's office reviewing the findings, the clinical language on the report couldn't mask the horrifying reality. The water contained a carefully measured dose of odorless, tasteless antifreeze ethylene glycol mixed with a sedative commonly prescribed for sleep disorders. "The combination is particularly concerning," Dr. Lewis explained, her professional demeanor tempered by genuine distress. "The sedative would have made you sleepy and uncoordinated, while the ethylene glycol poisoning would have appeared as confused behavior, followed by what could easily be mistaken for a stroke or heart attack in someone your age. The methodical precision was chilling, a poisoning strategy specifically designed to mimic natural causes in an elderly person, minimizing questions or investigation. Not a crime of passion or momentary desperation, but calculated planning by someone who knew my medical history intimately. Would it have been fatal, I asked, needing clarity despite the pain of the question. At this concentration, almost certainly, she confirmed, especially given your age and the kidney issues noted in your medical history. The symptoms would have developed over 12 to 24 hours, by which time organ damage would likely have been irreversible without immediate specialized treatment. Treatment that would have been unlikely if everyone believed I was simply experiencing expected health deterioration in my 70s. Exactly the narrative Richard had been carefully establishing with people in my life. We need to contact law. Enforcement immediately, Dr. Lewis continued. This is unambiguous evidence of attempted murder, Eleanor. There's no other way to characterize it. Despite the clear logic of her recommendation, I found myself hesitating. Pursuing criminal charges meant accepting that my only child had deliberately attempted to end my life for financial gain, a reality so fundamentally devastating that some part of me still sought alternatives, despite overwhelming evidence. Is there any possibility of error in the analysis, I asked, searching for uncertainty where none existed? Dr. Lewis understood the emotional resistance behind my question. Margaret had the sample analyzed by 2 separate laboratories to ensure absolute verification, she explained gently. Both produced identical findings. There's no ambiguity about what was in that water or its likely effects. As we discussed next steps, my phone signaled an incoming call from my attorney, Catherine Bennett. The timing seemed odd until she explained the reason for her urgency. Eleanor Richard has just filed an emergency petition for guardianship with the probate court, she informed me. Professional calm masking clear concern. He's claiming rapid cognitive deterioration, requiring immediate intervention to protect your assets and well-being. He scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. The calculated timing couldn't be coincidental. Richard must have anticipated the timeline for the water analysis and moved to establish legal control before evidence of his actions could be formally presented. His strategy revealed both desperation and continued underestimation of my preparedness. He's provided affidavits from neighbors claiming you've shown increasingly erratic behavior, Catherine continued, and documentation from a neurologist. I've never heard of a testing to concerning cognitive assessments supposedly conducted during wellness visits. I've never seen any neurologist except through referrals from Dr. Lewis, I clarified immediately. I suspected as much, Catherine confirmed. The petition is clearly fraudulent, but it's crafted to create immediate concerns that some judges might act upon pending full evaluation. We need to respond immediately and comprehensively. Dr. Lewis, who had been listening to my side of the conversation, gestured for permission to speak with Catherine directly. After I activated the speakerphone, she provided crucial context. I'm with Eleanor now reviewing toxicology results from a water sample collected from her home, she explained succinctly. The findings confirmed deliberate poisoning attempt with ethylene glycol and prescription sedatives. We were just discussing contacting law enforcement when you called. The line went silent momentarily as Catherine processed this significant escalation. This changes everything, she finally responded. The guardianship petition isn't just fraudulent, it appears to be an attempt to gain control before his actions could be exposed. We need to coordinate an immediate, multifaceted response. The next several hours passed in carefully orchestrated activity. Dr. Lewis accompanied me to the police station where Detective Morales from the Elder Crimes Unit took detailed statements and formally logged the toxicology evidence. Catherine simultaneously prepared emergency counter-filings for the court hearing, including comprehensive medical documentation of my cognitive health and sworn statements regarding Richard's concerning behavior patterns. By evening, events had accelerated beyond anything I could have anticipated. Richard had been brought in for questioning based on the toxicology evidence and video documentation. My home had been processed as a potential crime scene, with additional substances found in my kitchen matching the compounds identified in the water sample. Most disturbingly, investigators discovered detailed notes on Richard's phone outlining symptoms of antifreeze poisoning and how they might present differently in elderly victims. The evidence was overwhelming, but the emotional reality remained impossible to fully process. How had my only child, the baby I had nursed through illnesses, the boy whose science fair projects I had helped complete, the man whose business ventures I had financially supported, despite reservations, transformed into someone capable of such calculated harm? As I sat in Catherine's office reviewing documentation for the next day's hearing, this question haunted me more than concerns about legal proceedings or potential outcomes. Understanding the progression that led to such profound moral failure seemed essential not just for legal purposes, but for my own capacity to integrate this reality into my understanding of our family history. The financial investigation is revealing significant context, Catherine noted, reviewing preliminary findings from the forensic accountant she had engaged. Richard's business has been functionally insolvent for at least 2 years. He's taken multiple high-interest loans using falsified collateral documentation. There are substantial gambling debts through offshore accounts, and the family home has 3 mortgages, all currently in default status. The scale of financial desperation explained the motivation, but not the willingness to cross such a fundamental moral boundary. Many people face financial crisis without contemplating murder as a solution, particularly of a parent who likely would have offered legitimate help if approached honestly. "There's something else you should know," Catherine added with obvious reluctance. "The insurance investigation has identified 2 previous policies Richard obtained on your life through different carriers. Both were purchased and then allowed to lapse when premium payments stopped. The pattern suggests this wasn't a first attempt at this approach, just the first one that progressed to active implementation. This revelation suggested a progression more calculated than momentary desperation. Multiple preliminary efforts before the final implementation attempt. The methodical nature contradicted any narrative of temporary moral failure under extreme circumstances, revealing instead systematic planning over extended periods. As evening deepened into night, I returned to Margaret's home, where I had agreed to stay until security measures could be implemented at my house. The spare bedroom felt simultaneously foreign and comforting, unfamiliar surroundings, providing safety precisely when my actual home had been transformed into a crime scene by my own son's actions. "You should try to rest." Margaret encouraged, bringing tea that I couldn't help examining carefully before drinking, despite knowing it was safe. "Tomorrow's hearing will be emotionally demanding, and you'll need your strength." The concern in her eyes reflected understanding that transcended the immediate circumstances. As a toxicologist who had worked with law enforcement for decades, she had encountered family betrayals before, though perhaps none so personal as a son methodically planning a mother's death. "How do you reconcile knowing someone you loved was capable of this?" I asked, voicing the question that continued circling through my thoughts. Not the legal aspects or practical precautions, but the fundamental reshaping of your entire understanding of someone central to your life. Margaret considered the question with the it deserved, rather than offering reflexive reassurance. "In my professional experience, this level of betrayal isn't something most people fully reconcile," she acknowledged. Instead, they learn to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, the person they genuinely loved and the person who proved capable of profound harm. Both realities remain valid, which is what makes it so painful. Her honesty was more comforting than platitudes would have been. The permission to embrace complexity, rather than forced resolution, provided space for authentic processing, rather than artificially imposed closure. My father once told me that the most difficult diagnoses aren't those with clear symptoms, but those where the patient's presentation contradicts what testing reveals. I recalled finding unexpected relevance in his medical wisdom. He said the challenge isn't choosing which evidence to believe, but learning to integrate seemingly incompatible findings into a more complex understanding than initially assumed. That insight seemed particularly applicable now. Learning to integrate the son I had loved with the person capable of calculating my death for financial gain. Not choosing between these contradictory understandings, but expanding my perspective to contain both simultaneously, however painful that expansion might be. The morning brought new developments that further complicated this integration. As we prepared to leave for the courthouse, Detective Morales called with updated information from the ongoing investigation. Mrs. Winters, we've identified communications between your son and his wife Charlotte that significantly impact our understanding. Of the situation, he explained carefully. Text messages dating back approximately 8 months show Charlotte repeatedly pushing Richard to solve the inheritance issue immediately and researching strategies to, in her words, accelerate access to Eleanor's assets before she gives everything to charity or blows it all on cruises. This new information introduced another dimension to the already complex situation. The possibility that Richard had been influenced or pressured rather than acting solely from internal motivation. While this didn't diminish his responsibility, it added context that slightly shifted my understanding of his actions. There's more, Detective Morales continued. We found evidence that Charlotte has a history of similar behavior. Before marrying Richard, she was investigated in connection with an elderly neighbor's suspicious death after being added to his will. The case was never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern is concerning. The detective's tone conveyed professional restraint, masking genuine alarm. The possibility that Charlotte had identified my son as a pathway to financial gain through similar means previously attempted with others. This didn't excuse Richard's actions, but suggested manipulative influence that might have exploited existing weaknesses rather than representing entirely self-generated moral failure. As we arrived at the courthouse for the guardianship hearing, I found myself processing this new information while preparing to face my son across the courtroom. The competing narratives, Richard as calculated predator versus Richard as manipulated participant, created emotional complexity that defied simple resolution. The courtroom fell silent as Richard was let in the handcuffs on his wrists, creating a jarring contrast with the expensive suit he still wore from the previous day's arrest. His confident posture had collapsed, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone facing consequences he had never truly believed would materialize. This hearing was meant to address Richard's emergency guardianship petition, but the circumstances had transformed dramatically overnight. Judge Carla Mendez, a veteran of the probate court system with 25 years of experience, had been briefed on the criminal investigation and toxicology findings, adding layers of complexity beyond typical guardianship proceedings. Before we addressed the petition itself, Judge Mendez began her tone, reflecting the unusual gravity of the situation. I need to acknowledge the related criminal investigation concerning attempted poisoning, which directly impacts claims made in these filings. Ms. Bennett as counsel for Eleanor Winters. Would you like to address the court regarding the petition's validity given these developments? Catherine rose with the measured confidence of someone who had anticipated exactly this direction. Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of the guardianship petition on multiple grounds. First, the timing clearly indicates this filing was a preemptive attempt to gain control before criminal actions could be exposed. Second, we have comprehensive medical documentation from Dr. Sarah Lewis confirming Mrs. Winters' complete cognitive competence. And third, the petitioner has demonstrated through his own actions that his motives are not the protection of Mrs. Winters, but rather obtaining control of her assets through fraudulent claims about her capacity. Richard's attorney, Douglas Parker, appeared visibly uncomfortable as he rose to respond. The senior partner at his prestigious firm had clearly not been fully briefed on the circumstances when taking the case just 24 hours earlier. His discomfort suggested he was now caught representing a client whose actions were far more problematic than initially presented. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the serious allegations in the criminal investigation, they remain unproven at this stage. The guardianship petition stands on its own merits based on documented concerns about Mrs. Winters' decision-making capacity and potential vulnerability. Judge Mendez's expression reflected skepticism that cut through the attorney's procedural argument. Mr. Parker, the petition contains affidavits from a Dr. Wilson attesting to cognitive assessments of Mrs. Winters. The prosecution has already provided evidence that no such doctor ever treated Mrs. Winters and that these documents appear to be fraudulent. Are you prepared to defend the submission of falsified medical documentation to this court? The direct question left no room for procedural maneuvering. Parker glanced briefly at Richard, whose expression had hardened into something between defiance and resignation, before responding carefully. "Your Honor, I was not personally involved in gathering these supporting documents and cannot speak to their provenance. Given this new information, we request a brief recess to consult with our client." The requested consultation never materialized. Instead, as the judge announced a 15-minute recess, Richard suddenly stood, despite his attorney's attempt to restrain him. "This is ridiculous," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "My mother has been making increasingly erratic financial decisions for years. The recent paranoid behavior, installing hidden cameras, making wild accusations, only confirms what family members have observed for months. This attempted poisoning narrative is a complete fabrication to avoid proper oversight of her diminishing capacity." The outburst revealed a desperation I recognized from childhood tantrums when Richard's carefully constructed stories began unraveling under scrutiny. The familiar pattern of doubling down rather than acknowledging reality was both painful and strangely comforting. Evidence that the son I had raised remained recognizable within the person now facing criminal charges. Before his attorney could intervene, Richard continued, now addressing me directly. "Mom, you've always chosen your precious independence over family needs. Even now, you'd rather believe I tried to harm you than admit you need help managing your affairs. This whole poisoning story is exactly the kind of paranoid fantasy that proves my concerns are valid," Judge Mendez interrupted firmly. "Mr. Winters, these statements are inappropriate and potentially self-incriminating. I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel before continuing." The warning came too late. Richard's emotional reaction had already undermined his legal position more effectively than any opposing argument could have. His desperate attempt to maintain the narrative of my cognitive decline directly contradicted the composed, clearly competent woman sitting across the courtroom, a contrast obvious to everyone present. Detective Morales, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, approached the bench and requested permission to address the court. After Judge Mendez granted his request, he provided a succinct update on the criminal investigation. "Your Honor, overnight forensic analysis of electronic devices seized from the Winters residence has revealed extensive research on untraceable poisons methods to mimic natural death in elderly individuals, and detailed notes on Mrs. Winters' medication schedule and potential interactions. Additionally, we've recovered deleted communications between Richard Winters and his wife Charlotte discussing various scenarios for accelerating inheritance and references to previous unsuccessful attempts involving medication tampering. This public confirmation of premeditated planning eliminated any remaining possibility that Richard's actions represented momentary desperation rather than calculated intent. The systematic research and multiple attempts described by Detective Morales revealed a campaign of predatory behavior spanning months rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Richard's expression transformed as he realized the extent of evidence against him. The defiance drained away, replaced by something closer to the calculation I had glimpsed when switching our water glasses, the recognition that previous strategies had failed, requiring rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. "I'd like to speak to my mother alone," he requested, suddenly his tone shifting to carefully modulated contrition. "There are explanations she deserves to hear directly without legal filters." The transparent attempt to access me privately, potentially to manipulate or intimidate, was immediately blocked by both Catherine and Judge Mendez. All communication will occur through proper channels. With counsel present, Judge Mendez ruled firmly. Now, regarding the guardianship petition itself, I am dismissing it with prejudice based on clear evidence of fraudulent filings and improper purpose. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order prohibiting Richard Winters from any contact. With Eleanor Winters outside of court-supervised proceedings, the decisive ruling effectively ended the immediate legal threat to my independence, though the criminal process was just beginning. As the hearing concluded and Richard was escorted back into custody, his gaze locked with mine momentarily across the courtroom. The expression contained contradictions impossible to fully interpret. Anger and fear, certainly, but perhaps also something resembling recognition of opportunity irretrievably lost. As we left the courthouse, I found myself unexpectedly overwhelmed. The adrenaline that had sustained me through careful preparation and legal proceedings began to fade, leaving space for the emotional reality I had been methodically compartmentalizing. Catherine noticed immediately, guiding me to a private waiting area where I could process without public observation. "It's normal to experience delayed reaction," she assured me gently. "You've been operating in strategic response mode for weeks. The protective focus on practical actions creates temporary emotional distance that allows functionality during crisis." Her understanding provided permission for the complex grief finally emerging, not just for the betrayal itself, but for the permanent transformation of my relationship with my only child and, by extension, my grandchildren. The criminal proceedings would continue with substantial evidence suggesting conviction was likely, but the family relationships had already been irrevocably altered, regardless of legal outcomes. What happens with the grandchildren? I asked, voicing the concern that had remained secondary during immediate safety considerations, but now emerged as a central worry. They're innocent in all this, but their lives will be fundamentally disrupted. Catherine had anticipated this question, having already researched options while respecting my need to focus on immediate proceedings. "There are several possibilities depending on Charlotte's level of involvement and your preferences regarding ongoing contact. We can discuss supervised visitation arrangements through family court, potentially bypassing both parents if Charlotte's complicity is established." The prospect of maintaining connection with my grandchildren offered small comfort within the broader devastation. These children, ages 10 and 7, had done nothing to deserve the chaos adult decisions would create in their lives. Preserving some stability and relationship continuity for them became my immediate priority beyond the criminal proceedings themselves. Detective Morales approached as we prepared to leave, his professional demeanor tempered by genuine concern. "Mrs. Winters, we've completed the processing of your home. It's been cleared for your return, though I understand if you might prefer alternative arrangements for the immediate future." The practical consideration, whether I could emotionally return to a home now transformed by awareness of what had occurred within it, hadn't fully registered until this moment. The dining room where Richard had attempted to poison me, the kitchen where he had prepared the contaminated water, the living room where we had reviewed family photographs together while he calculated my death. Could these spaces ever feel safe again? "We've arranged temporary accommodations while you consider longer-term preferences," Margaret offered, having anticipated this challenge. "You can take whatever time you need to determine whether remaining in your home feels appropriate." After circumstances changed so dramatically, her understanding acknowledged that physical safety and emotional security were separate considerations. The house could be objectively secure while remaining subjectively contaminated by awareness of what had occurred there. This recognition of emotional reality alongside practical considerations provided space for authentic healing rather than pressured decisions. As we left the courthouse through an entrance to avoid media attention, I found myself reflecting on my father's wisdom about diagnosis, requiring complete information integration rather than selective evidence interpretation. The painful truth I now faced required similarly comprehensive integration, acknowledging both the son I had loved and the person capable of calculated harm without allowing either reality to negate the other. The coming weeks would bring further criminal proceedings, potential testimony, continued investigation into Charlotte's involvement, and careful consideration of my grandchildren's well-being. Each stage would require balancing justice with the complicated reality of family relationships fundamentally altered but not erased by betrayal. 6 weeks after the courthouse hearing, I sat in the visitors area of the county detention center, separated from Richard by a plexiglass barrier that felt like a physical manifestation of what had happened to our relationship. This was our first face-to-face conversation since the day I had switched our water glasses, revealing his intentions and forever altering our family's trajectory. Richard looked diminished in his institutional uniform, the confident executive persona shed like an outgrown skin. His eyes held a weariness I'd never seen before, the cautious assessment of someone who had lost the ability to predict outcomes or control circumstances. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he began, his voice quieter than I remembered. "I wasn't sure either," I acknowledged honestly, "but there are questions only you can answer." The criminal case had progressed rapidly since the initial hearing. The toxicology evidence was unambiguous, the digital forensics damning, and the financial motive clearly established. Richard's attorney had already begun plea negotiations, recognizing the overwhelming evidence made trial a risky proposition with potentially harsher consequences. What remained unclear and what had ultimately brought me to this difficult meeting were the human elements beneath the legal proceedings. Understanding the progression from the son who had once brought me hand-picked wildflowers to the man who had researched untraceable poisons felt necessary not just for legal closure, but for my own capacity to integrate this reality. Charlotte has been cooperating with the prosecution, I said, watching his reaction carefully. She's provided extensive documentation about the financial planning and previous attempts. His expression hardened momentarily before resignation settled across his features. Of course she has self-preservation was always her specialty. The bitterness in his tone suggested complexities in their relationship I hadn't fully recognized. The investigation had already revealed Charlotte's previous involvement with suspicious deaths and financial windfalls, suggesting a pattern that preceded her relationship with Richard. Was this her idea initially, I asked directly, needing clarity about the origin point of the betrayal. Richard's response came after careful consideration rather than defensive reaction. The insurance policies were her suggestion. She presented it as standard estate planning at first, then gradually expanded the concept. But I can't blame her entirely. I could have said no at any point. This partial acknowledgement of responsibility represented the first crack in the defensive posturing he had maintained since his arrest. The admission wasn't complete, but it suggested potential capacity for honest reflection that previous interactions hadn't revealed. When did it change? From paperwork to active planning. I asked, needing to understand the progression from unethical financial maneuvering to attempted murder. His gaze dropped to his hands, which had begun fidgeting on the counter before him. After the third business loan was called in, we were underwater on the house, the kids' private school was threatening expulsion over unpaid tuition, and Charlotte's shopping habits hadn't adjusted to our reality. He paused, seeming to recognize the inadequacy of financial pressure as justification. But that doesn't explain crossing that line. Plenty of people face financial ruin without contemplating what I did. The rare moment of genuine insight suggested that whatever process had led to this point, Richard retained some capacity for moral recognition, a small but significant point of connection to the son I had raised rather than the stranger who had emerged through criminal investigation. Why didn't you just ask for help? The question emerged from the core of my maternal confusion. Throughout his adult life, I had provided financial assistance when genuinely needed, though admittedly with conditions designed to encourage responsibility rather than dependency. Pride shamed the narrative I'd created about being self-made rather than family-supported. Each reason came with increasing honesty. And eventually, Charlotte convinced me you'd never provide enough to solve the scale of problems we faced, that your assistance always came with strings that undermined my authority. This explanation aligned with patterns that had emerged in their seized communications. Charlotte's systematic isolation of Richard from family support while cultivating dependency and resentment. The manipulation didn't absolve him of responsibility, but provided context that helped explain the seemingly incomprehensible progression. The investigation found evidence of medication tampering. Before the water incident, I noted needing confirmation about how close previous attempts had come. The dosage adjustments were minor enough to make you seem confused or forgetful in front of others, building the cognitive decline narrative, but not enough to cause serious harm. His clinical description revealed the calculated nature of their approach. The water was the first he paused, seemingly unable to complete the sentence directly. The first actual attempt on my life I finished for him, refusing to allow euphemisms to obscure reality. He nodded once, unable to meet my eyes. The confirmation shouldn't have carried additional pain given what I already knew from the investigation, yet hearing it directly from him created a finality that evidence alone hadn't fully conveyed. Our conversation continued for the allotted 30 minutes, covering ground that felt both necessary and insufficient. No single conversation could fully reconcile the fundamental questions raised by his actions, but the exchange provided pieces previously missing from my understanding context that wouldn't excuse but might help explain the inexplicable. As our time drew to a close, Richard finally asked the question that seemed to weigh most heavily on him. What happens with the kids? Now. Will you tell them what happened? The question reflected the one area where our concerns still genuinely aligned: the well-being of two children caught in circumstances beyond their understanding or responsibility. Charlotte's sister has temporary custody while the investigation continues, I explained. I've arranged regular visitation through family court. They know you're dealing with legal problems, but not the specific nature. We'll work with child psychologists to determine appropriate disclosures as they mature. Relief visibly washed over him at the confirmation his children were being cared for, though the reality of their separation clearly pained him. Whatever moral boundaries he had been willing to cross, his concern for his children appeared genuine. As our visit concluded and guards arrived to escort him back to his cell, Richard spoke a final sentence that contained no excuses or justifications, just simple acknowledgement. I'm sorry, Mom, not just for getting caught, but for becoming someone who could do this to you. The words weren't sufficient to heal the wound his actions had created, but they represented the first genuine step toward whatever relationship might remain possible in the aftermath of betrayal this profound. In the weeks that followed legal proceedings continued along predictable lines. Richard accepted a plea agreement for attempted murder and fraud charges that would result in substantial prison time but avoid the maximum penalties a trial conviction might have imposed. Charlotte faced separate charges related to conspiracy and financial crimes, with additional investigations continuing in other jurisdictions regarding her previous relationships with deceased individuals. More significant than the legal resolution was my personal journey towards some form of integration and healing. After careful consideration, I decided to sell my home of 40 years, not from fear, but from recognition that spaces hold memories that influence our capacity to move forward. The house that had witnessed my marriage, Richard's childhood, and ultimately his betrayal, carried too many contradictory associations to serve as foundation for whatever life would follow this profound disruption. With Margaret's support, I found a smaller home in a nearby community close enough to maintain my established medical care and social connections, while offering the symbolic fresh start that felt necessary for emotional healing. The new space reflected intentional choices, rather than accommodation to trauma, with security features integrated unobtrusively rather than as constant reminders of vulnerability. Most importantly, I established regular visits with my grandchildren, creating a stable presence in lives suddenly disrupted by adult actions beyond their control or understanding. Their resilience provided unexpected inspiration. Their capacity to adapt to changed circumstances while maintaining essential connections offered lessons in moving forward without denying painful realities. 6 months after that initial moment of switching water glasses, I sat with Dr. Lewis during a regular checkup, discussing my progress beyond the physical health concerns that had initially connected us. You've navigated extraordinarily difficult circumstances with remarkable resilience, she observed. Many people would have become defined by victimization in similar situations. Her observation prompted reflection on what had allowed me to maintain some essential sense of self, despite circumstances that might reasonably have shattered my fundamental understanding of family and safety. My father taught me something I didn't fully appreciate until recently, I shared. He said, diagnosis requires accepting apparent contradictions rather than forcing simpler explanations. The same person who brought you soup when you were sick might later harm you deliberately. Both realities exist simultaneously, and integration requires holding that complexity rather than seeking simpler narratives. This philosophy had become central to my healing process. The capacity to acknowledge the son I had loved and the man who had betrayed that love as coexisting realities rather than competing narratives requiring resolution. The complexity was painful, but ultimately more honest than either total rejection or misplaced forgiveness. The financial settlement from the insurance fraud investigation had provided resources beyond my needs, leading to the establishment of a foundation supporting elderly individuals vulnerable to exploitation. Transforming personal trauma into structural response offered purpose that transcended individual healing, creating meaning from circumstances that might otherwise remain simply tragic. My relationship with Richard continued through monthly supervised visits, not from naive forgiveness or denial of reality, but from recognition that complete severance served neither my healing nor his potential rehabilitation. The boundaries remained clear and non-negotiable, but maintaining connection within appropriate limits honored the complexity of family relationships, even when fundamentally altered by betrayal. 2 years after switching those water glasses at my dining room table, I stood at a podium addressing the National Conference on Elder Safety, looking out at hundreds of professionals dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors from exploitation and abuse. The journey from shocked victim to public advocate had been neither linear nor easy, but it represented healing transformed into purpose in ways I never could have anticipated. The most dangerous predators aren't strangers, I explained to the YOW attentive audience. They're those who understand our vulnerabilities because they've observed them intimately over years. They know exactly which emotional levers to pull to bypass our natural defenses. And most critically, they're the last people we want to believe could harm us, which creates the perfect blind spot. My case had become a reference point in professional training for law enforcement, social services, and healthcare providers dealing with family-based exploitation. The methodical documentation I had maintained, the security measures I had implemented, and the support network I had cultivated all served as a template for protection strategies now taught to seniors in community programs nationwide. The foundation established with the insurance settlement funds, Vigilant Seniors Network, had grown from a small local initiative into a national organization providing both direct services and policy advocacy. Our trained volunteers conducted regular wellness checks for isolated elderly individuals. Our legal team offered pro bono representation for exploitation victims. Our technology specialists developed senior-friendly security systems with simplified interfaces that preserve dignity while creating safety. Most significantly, the organization created peer support networks connecting seniors who had experienced family betrayal. Perhaps the most isolating form of victimization, carrying shame and reluctance to acknowledge realities too painful for many to discuss. Openly, these connections reduced the isolation that often allowed exploitation to continue, unchallenged, creating community among those who understood the unique pain of harm from those you had raised and loved. As I concluded my presentation and the audience rose in applause, I caught sight of Margaret in the front row, still my closest friend, and now the Foundation's Director of Forensic Services. Her presence reminded me of the critical role support networks play in recovery from trauma. No single relationship could have provided everything needed to navigate circumstances this complex, but the collective wisdom and complementary strengths of trusted allies had created a safety net that caught me when family structures collapsed. During the reception that followed, I was approached by a federal prosecutor whose team had recently uncovered a multi-state elder exploitation ring targeting wealthy seniors through manipulated family relationships. "Your case created the template for our investigative approach," she explained. "The documentation methods you developed have been formalized into our standard protocols. We've successfully prosecuted 8 cases using evidence collection approaches modeled on your experience. The validation that my painful journey had helped protect others offered meaning beyond personal healing. While I would never have chosen these circumstances, the impact of sharing my experience had created protective ripples extending far beyond my individual situation." As the conference concluded, I returned to my new home, a comfortable condominium in a building where I had rebuilt my life with intentional choices rather than reactions to trauma. The space reflected both practical security considerations and personal preferences that honored my current needs rather than maintaining patterns established in earlier life phases. My grandchildren, now 12 and 9, were scheduled for their weekly visit the following day. These relationships had become one of the few continuing connections to my previous life, maintained not from obligation, but from genuine love and recognition that these children deserved stability despite adult failings. Our relationship had evolved into something new rather than attempting to preserve previous patterns honest about circumstances while age-appropriate in explanations. "Grandma, can we make those special cookies tomorrow?" my granddaughter had asked during our last phone call, referring to a family recipe that had survived the transition between life chapters. These small continuities, recipes, stories, traditions provided threads of connection without denying the fundamental changes in our family structure. The most complex aspect of my reconstructed life remained the monthly visits to the correctional facility where Richard was serving his 15-year sentence. Each visit required careful emotional preparation, balancing appropriate boundaries with the reality that complete severance served neither healing nor accountability. Our most recent conversation had revealed continuing evolution in his understanding of his actions. The counseling group has been discussing cognitive distortions that enable harmful behavior he had shared, demonstrating actual engagement rather than performance for parole considerations. The entitlement thinking that made me believe I deserved financial stability, regardless of how it was obtained, I'm starting to recognize how deeply that distorted my decision-making. These glimpses of genuine reflection didn't erase the harm caused, but suggested the possibility of meaningful rehabilitation rather than merely serving time. My decision to maintain limited contact came not from naive forgiveness, but from recognition that complete abandonment would eliminate any motivation for the difficult internal work necessary for genuine change. Catherine, who had remained both my attorney and trusted advisor, maintained professional oversight of all legal and financial protections while encouraging appropriate healing processes. Maintaining controlled contact doesn't mean minimizing what happened. She had reminded me during a particularly difficult period. It means you're choosing a response based on what serves recovery, rather than what might seem expected or deserved. Her perspective highlighted an essential truth about healing from profound betrayal, that responses based solely on what someone deserves often trap both parties in cycles that prevent growth or resolution. The limited supervised contact I maintained with Richard represented an intentional choice serving multiple legitimate purposes, rather than misplaced forgiveness or denial of reality. The criminal justice process had ultimately confirmed Charlotte's central role in orchestrating the financial scheme and poisoning attempt. Her previous pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals for financial gain had been established through evidence from 3 separate jurisdictions, resulting in consecutive sentences that ensured she would remain incarcerated well beyond Richard's eventual release. This confirmation of her manipulative influence didn't diminish Richard's responsibility, but provided context that helped explain the seemingly incomprehensible transformation in someone I had known intimately from birth. Understanding the progression from financial desperation to moral compromise to criminal action offered clarity that, while painful, was preferable to permanent confusion about how such betrayal had developed. Dr. Lewis, who had continued providing both medical care and emotional support throughout this journey, often reminded me that healing doesn't follow predictable timelines or patterns. Some days will feel like tremendous progress, others like starting from the beginning, she had explained early in the process. Both are normal parts of integration rather than signs of failure or success. This permission to experience healing as nonlinear rather than progressive achievement had proven particularly valuable during inevitable setbacks holidays that triggered grief for lost family cohesion, legal proceedings that reopened emotional wounds, unexpected reminders of betrayal embedded in seemingly unrelated situations. Rather than interpreting these difficult moments as healing failures, I had learned to recognize them as necessary integration components, requiring compassionate accommodation rather than frustrated resistance. Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of recovery had been finding genuine joy and purpose beyond survival. The initial months after Richard's arrest had focused necessarily on basic functionality, maintaining health, ensuring safety, navigating legal proceedings. As immediate crises stabilized, space emerged for rediscovering capacities and interests independent of trauma response. I had joined a community arts program initially recommended for therapeutic benefits, but quickly discovered genuine pleasure in watercolor painting, an interest I had never pursued during decades focused on family and professional responsibilities. The creative process offered both meditative focus that quieted anxious thoughts and tangible evidence of capacity for beauty creation, despite experiencing profound ugliness. The close friendships developed through this period, not just with Margaret and Catherine, who had been present from the beginning, but with new connections formed through foundation work and community involvement, reflected relationships based on authentic current reality, rather than shared history or family obligation. These connections validated that trust remained possible, even after fundamental betrayal, though, with appropriate boundaries and earned rather than assumed reliability. My relationship with my grandchildren had evolved into something possibly more authentic than might have developed without the family crisis. The necessary honesty about their father's actions, carefully modulated for developmental appropriateness but never falsified, had established expectations of truth and transparency that created foundation for genuine connection, rather than performance or pretense. Dad did something very wrong because he made seriously bad choices, I had explained, when questions inevitably emerged. Those choices have consequences that affect all of us. But you didn't make those choices, and nothing changes how much I love you or your place in my life. This balanced acknowledgement of reality, while affirming unconditional love, provided security amid circumstances that might otherwise have created devastating instability. The consistency of my presence and boundaries offered structure they could rely upon while processing complex family realities beyond their full comprehension. As I prepared for the following day's activities, a foundation board meeting followed. By my grandchildren's visit, I found myself reflecting on my father's wisdom that had proved unexpectedly relevant throughout this journey. His guidance about diagnosis requiring integration of seemingly contradictory evidence had provided framework not just for understanding what had happened, but for rebuilding meaningful life afterward. The capacity to hold complex, seemingly incompatible truth simultaneously, that I had raised someone capable of calculating my death. That manipulation had influenced but not eliminated moral responsibility. That protection required boundaries, while healing benefited from controlled connection, had allowed navigation through circumstances where simplified narratives would have failed completely. The criminal justice process had ultimately confirmed Charlotte's central role in orchestrating the financial scheme and poisoning attempt. Her previous pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals for financial gain had been established through evidence from 3 separate jurisdictions, resulting in consecutive sentences that ensured she would remain incarcerated well beyond Richard's eventual release. This confirmation of her manipulative influence didn't diminish Richard's responsibility, but provided context that helped explain the seemingly incomprehensible transformation in someone I had known intimately from birth. Understanding the progression from financial desperation to moral compromise to criminal action offered clarity that, while painful, was preferable to permanent confusion about how such betrayal had developed. Dr. Lewis, who had continued providing both medical care and emotional support throughout this journey, often reminded me that healing doesn't follow predictable timelines or patterns. Some days will feel like tremendous progress, others like starting from the beginning, she had explained early in the process. Both are normal parts of integration rather than signs of failure or success. This permission to experience healing as non-linear rather than progressive achievement had proven particularly valuable during inevitable setbacks. Holidays that triggered grief for lost family cohesion, legal proceedings that reopened emotional wounds, unexpected reminders of betrayal embedded in seemingly unrelated situations. Rather than interpreting these difficult moments as healing failures, I had learned to recognize them as necessary integration components requiring compassionate accommodation rather than frustrated resistance. Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of recovery had been finding genuine joy and purpose beyond survival. The initial months after Richard's arrest had focused necessarily on basic functionality, maintaining health, ensuring safety, navigating legal proceedings. As immediate crises stabilized, space emerged for rediscovering capacities and interests independent of trauma response. I had joined a community arts program initially recommended for therapeutic benefits, but quickly discovered genuine pleasure in watercolor painting, an interest I had never pursued during decades, focused on family and professional responsibilities. The creative process offered both meditative focus that quieted anxious thoughts and tangible evidence of capacity for beauty creation, despite experiencing profound ugliness. The close friendships developed through this period, not just with Margaret and Catherine, who had been present from the beginning, but with new connections formed through foundation work and community involvement, reflected relationships based on authentic current reality rather than shared history or family obligation. These connections validated that trust remained possible, even after fundamental betrayal, though, with appropriate boundaries and earned rather than assumed reliability. My relationship with my grandchildren had evolved into something possibly more authentic than might have developed without the family crisis. The necessary honesty about their father's actions, carefully modulated for developmental appropriateness but never falsified, had established expectations of truth and transparency that created foundation for genuine connection rather than performance or pretense. Dad did something very wrong because he made seriously bad choices, I had explained when questions inevitably emerged. Those choices have consequences that affect all of us, but you didn't make those choices, and nothing changes how much I love you or your place in my life. This balanced acknowledgement of reality while affirming unconditional love provided security amid circumstances that might otherwise have created devastating instability. The consistency of my presence and boundaries offered structure they could rely upon while processing complex family realities beyond their full comprehension. As I prepared for the following day's activities, a foundation board meeting followed by my grandchildren's visit, I found myself reflecting on my father's wisdom that had proved unexpectedly relevant throughout this journey. His guidance about diagnosis requiring integration of seemingly contradictory evidence had provided framework not just for understanding what had happened, but for rebuilding meaningful life afterward. The capacity to hold complex, seemingly incompatible truths simultaneously that I had raised someone capable of calculating my death, that manipulation had influenced but not eliminated moral responsibility, that protection required boundaries, while healing benefited from controlled connection, had allowed navigation through circumstances where simplified narratives would have failed completely. 3 years into Richard's 15-year sentence, I received a letter that would once again shift the foundation of everything I thought I understood about my family's tragedy. The prison envelope arrived on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, the EI handwriting on the address unfamiliar and distinctly feminine. Inside was a 12-page handwritten confession from Charlotte Richards' wife, written from the Women's Correctional Facility, where she was serving her 20-year sentence. Unlike her testimony during the legal proceedings, which had positioned her as Richard's unwilling accomplice manipulated by financial desperation, this account offered a starkly different narrative, one that painted a far more calculated picture of events leading to that fateful water glass. Mrs. Winters. She began the formal address, striking an odd tone given our history. What you're about to read isn't an attempt to gain sympathy or reduce my sentence. It's information you deserve to have about what really happened, why it happened, and the extent to which I deliberately manipulated your son into actions he would never have contemplated without my influence. The pages that followed detailed a methodical campaign spanning their entire marriage, a campaign I had glimpsed through investigation, but never fully comprehended in its systematic precision. Charlotte described first identifying Richard as a target, specifically because of his connection to family wealth. His need for validation and personality traits she had learned to recognize as manipulable through her previous relationships. I selected Richard after careful research into potential targets with certain characteristics, she wrote, with chilling detachment, access to family wealth, unresolved need for parental approval, and a tendency toward financial overextension to maintain appearances. These traits create exploitable vulnerabilities when properly leveraged. This cold analysis of my son as prey rather than partner crystallized something I had sensed but never fully articulated, that Charlotte's role hadn't merely been influence but deliberate predation. The methodical approach she described transcended simple financial desperation, revealing instead a calculated operation with Richard as both instrument and victim. Most disturbing were the details of how she had systematically isolated him from family support while creating dependency on her approval. "I needed to position myself as his only emotional safe harbor," she explained. "This required gradually undermining his confidence in family relationships, particularly with you. I would subtly reframe your legitimate financial boundaries as lack of belief in his capabilities, transforming normal parental guidance into perceived criticism. The calculated manipulation extended to every aspect of their relationship, including parenthood itself. The children were necessary for creating both permanence in the relationship and additional leverage for financial discussions," she wrote, with a frankness I found physically nauseating. "Children create financial pressures that can justify increasingly desperate measures when framed properly." I put the letter down several times, needing breaks from its clinical dissection of familial exploitation. The portrait it painted was of someone who had approached relationships as tactical operations rather than emotional connections, a predatory methodology that had identified, isolated, and weaponized my son's vulnerabilities, while systematically removing protective influences from his life. Catherine, who reviewed the letter when I sought her guidance about its implications, confirmed its authenticity through prison authorities and her legal contacts. "This isn't performative remorse or manipulation of the legal system," she observed. "Charlotte isn't eligible for sentence reduction through this disclosure. If anything, these admissions could potentially result in additional charges in other jurisdictions." The question that consumed me wasn't about legal implications, but the human reality beneath them, how this information should influence my understanding of Richard's actions, and the carefully calibrated relationship I had maintained. Through monthly prison visits, Dr. Lewis provided perspective that helped navigate this emotional territory. This additional context doesn't eliminate Richard's moral agency or responsibility, she noted during our conversation. Adults retain the capacity to refuse harmful actions regardless of manipulation. However, it does provide important understanding about the systematic exploitation of specific vulnerabilities that influenced his decision-making. This balanced perspective, acknowledging manipulation without erasing responsibility, reflected the complex reality better than simplistic narratives of either complete exoneration or unchanged culpability. The truth resided in the difficult middle territory where multiple factors influenced outcomes without any single element providing complete explanation. Charlotte's letter continued with specific details about the poisoning plan itself, confirming what investigation had suggested, but with additional context about its development. The insurance policies were always intended as financial vehicles rather than legitimate estate planning, she admitted. But progression to active implementation occurred in stages that normalized increasingly unethical behavior through careful framing. Her methodical approach had created what she called ethical sliding small initial boundary violations that established precedent for larger transgressions through gradual normalization. Each step was presented as logical extension of previous decisions rather than significant moral threshold, she explained. By the time actual poisoning was implemented, countless smaller compromises had already recalibrated moral baselines. Perhaps most significant was her disclosure about Richard's actual role in the final implementation. Richard believed the substance in your water would cause temporary symptoms, creating documentation for the cognitive decline narrative, not permanent harm, she wrote. I deliberately misrepresented the substance's effects while encouraging his participation in what he understood as unethical but not lethal action. This claim contradicted physical evidence showing lethal concentrations in the water sample, suggesting either continued deception in Charlotte's account or her independent modification of the substance without Richard's knowledge. Catherine's legal assessment leaned toward the latter possibility. The toxicology findings were unambiguous about concentration levels, she reminded me. Either Charlotte is still manipulating narrative, or she adjusted dosage without Richard's knowledge, potentially planning to position him as responsible for unintended outcome. The complexity of this potential scenario, Richard participating in what he believed was temporary incapacitation, while Charlotte independently escalated to lethal intent, created moral ambiguity that defied simple categorization. His willing participation in harmful action remained inexcusable, yet the possibility of manipulation extending to the substance itself added layers requiring integration into my understanding. After careful consideration, I decided to bring the letter to our next scheduled prison visit, creating opportunity for direct conversation about its contents and implications. This decision reflected the communication approach that had characterized our constrained relationship throughout his incarceration, direct engagement with difficult realities rather than protective avoidance of painful topics. Richard's reaction upon seeing Charlotte's letter revealed emotions I hadn't witnessed since early stages of the investigation. The carefully maintained composure that had characterized our interactions crumbled visibly as he began reading, his hands trembling with increasing intensity as he progressed through the pages. "I didn't know it would kill you," he said, when finally looking up, his voice barely audible. "That doesn't excuse anything. I still agreed to something terrible, but I believed it would make you seem confused, temporarily creating documentation for the guardianship petition. I never knew." His voice trailed off as words proved inadequate for the moral complexity of partial culpability. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest exchange we had shared since his arrest. Without absolving himself of responsibility, Richard described the gradual progression Charlotte had engineered from financial partnership to increasingly questionable decisions to ethical compromises that expanded in scope until unthinkable actions had somehow become framed as necessary, steps in already established patterns. "I should have recognized what was happening," he acknowledged. "There were countless points where I could have stopped the progression. That failure is entirely mine, regardless of her influence. This capacity for nuanced self-assessment, acknowledging both external manipulation and personal responsibility without using either to negate the other, suggested emotional and moral development beyond what legal consequences alone might have produced." The rehabilitation work he had described in previous visits appeared to have created capacity for complexity rather than simplistic narrative about either victimhood or villainy. As our visit concluded, Richard asked a question that revealed his continuing struggle with identity integration. "How do you reconcile the person you thought I was with, what I became capable of doing? I don't understand how to hold both realities myself, let alone how you managed to do it." The question contained no expectation of simple comfort or absolution, just genuine inquiry about navigating the complexity of human capacity for both love and harm, often within the same relationship. My response reflected the understanding I had developed through my own healing journey. "I don't reconcile them," I explained truthfully. "I hold them simultaneously as coexisting realities: the son I loved, who brought me dandelions from the yard, and the man who participated in planning my harm. Both are true. Neither cancels the other, and integration means accepting that complexity rather than seeking simpler narrative that denies either reality." The visit ended with no dramatic resolution or emotional breakthrough, just quiet acknowledgement. Of shared journey through territory neither of us would have willingly chosen, but both were now required to navigate with whatever wisdom and compassion circumstances permitted. 5 years after that fateful dinner, when I switched our water glasses, I received a call from the Department of Corrections that I had been both anticipating and dreading. Richard was being considered for early release due to exemplary behavior and successful completion of multiple rehabilitation programs. As his victim, I was entitled to make a statement at his parole hearing, a responsibility that forced me to confront questions about justice safety and the possibility of redemption that I had been contemplating throughout his incarceration. "You're not obligated to participate in the hearing at all," Catherine reminded me as we discussed the notification in her office. "Your written statement would be equally valid, or you could choose not to provide input. Your experience has already been thoroughly documented in the case record." The options she outlined reflected the legal system's attempt to balance victim participation with protection from additional trauma. Yet something in me recognized that physical presence, while undoubtedly difficult, offered opportunity for closure that written statements couldn't provide. I need to be there. I decided after careful consideration not just to influence the outcome, but to complete my own understanding of this journey. My grandchildren, now 14 and 11, had developed into remarkably resilient individuals, despite family circumstances that might reasonably have created lasting damage. Our relationship had evolved from the initial crisis management into genuine connection based on honest communication appropriate to their developmental stages. They understood that their father had made serious mistakes, resulting in imprisonment, with details calibrated to their capacity for integration rather than protective deception. Their perspectives on Richard's potential release reflected this balanced understanding. "Dad's been writing me about the programs he's completed," my grandson shared during one of our weekend visits. "He seems different in his letters now compared to before, like he's really thinking about things instead of just saying what he thinks people want to hear." This observation from a 14-year-old demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize authentic reflection versus performance. My grandson had developed this discernment not despite family trauma, but partially because of the careful age-appropriate honesty with which it had been addressed. My granddaughter, younger but equally perceptive, approached the situation with characteristic directness. "If Dad comes home, will you still see us as much?" she asked during our baking session, cutting cookie dough with focused precision that contrasted with the vulnerability in her question. "Nothing will change our relationship," I assured her, recognizing the underlying concern about stability and connections that had become essential to her security. "Whatever happens with your father's situation, my relationship with you remains completely separate and absolutely certain." The reassurance reflected a fundamental truth about healthy family structures, that relationships could be simultaneously connected and independent, influenced by changing circumstances, without being fundamentally disrupted by them. This understanding had developed through necessity, but provided foundation for emotional resilience that served my grandchildren in all aspects of their lives. As the parole hearing approached, I sought guidance from the support network that had sustained me throughout this journey. Margaret Dr. Lewis and members of the survivor group I had joined through the foundation offered perspectives that helped clarify my own complicated feelings about Richard's potential release. Forgiveness and safety are separate considerations, observed Evelyn, an 83-year-old group member who had navigated similar family betrayal. You can acknowledge genuine rehabilitation without compromising boundaries necessary for your ongoing security. The question isn't whether he deserves release, but whether community safety and your well-being have been adequately addressed through demonstrated change. This distinction, separating moral judgment about deserving from practical assessment of safety, provided clarity about my approach to the hearing. Rather than positioning myself as arbiter of sufficient punishment, I could focus on evidence of rehabilitation and risk mitigation relevant to release considerations. The parole hearing itself was conducted in a small administrative room within the correctional facility, significantly less formal than courtroom proceedings, but with similar gravity and potential consequences. Richard sat with his attorney and prison counselor, visibly different from both the confident executive he had been before arrest and the defeated figure from early incarceration. The physical transformation reflected not just altered circumstances, but internal changes visible in how he carried himself, neither entitled nor diminished, but present, with clear-eyed acceptance of reality. When invited to speak, I approached the small podium with notes I had prepared through careful reflection rather than emotional reaction. The parole board members, 3 experienced professionals who had reviewed Richard's complete file, gave me their full attention as I began addressing the complex considerations from my unique perspective. "I come before you neither seeking additional punishment nor recommending automatic release." I began establishing the balanced approach Evelyn had helped me articulate. "My concern is ensuring that rehabilitation demonstrates genuine understanding of harm caused and sustained capacity to function without repeating patterns that led to these actions. Rather than focusing exclusively on my victimization, I addressed specific indicators of authentic change I had observed during our limited contact throughout Richard's incarceration. Initially, discussions centered on circumstances and external influences, financial pressure manipulation by his wife's stressors that supposedly explained behavior. Over time, this evolved into genuine accountability without qualification recognition that regardless of influences, his choices remained. His responsibility, the distinction I highlighted, represented fundamental shift from externalizing blame to internalizing responsibility, a necessary foundation for behavioral change beyond performance for system requirements. The prison counselor nodded slightly, suggesting this observation aligned with their professional assessment of Richard's progress. The rehabilitation programs Richard has completed appear to have developed capacity for perspective-taking previously absent in our interactions, I continued. Recent communications demonstrate consideration of impacts beyond intended consequences, understanding how actions affect not just direct targets, but wider circles of relationship and community. This expanded awareness of harm beyond immediate targets indicated moral development essential for preventing future exploitation of vulnerable individuals, the capacity to recognize ripple effects rather than narrowly defining harm in relation to specific intended outcomes. Most significantly, I addressed the relationship between genuine remorse and practical safety considerations. Remorse without behavioral change remains insufficient protection against recurrence. However, the systematic work Richard has undertaken suggests development of both emotional understanding and practical skills necessary for functioning without harmful patterns. The cognitive restructuring evident in our interactions indicates capacity for recognizing and interrupting thought patterns that previously enabled harmful actions. The parole board listened attentively, occasionally making notes, but primarily focused on understanding my unique perspective as someone who had both intimate knowledge of Richard before his crimes and continued limited contact throughout his rehabilitation process. Their questions focused on concrete observations about behavioral and cognitive changes rather than emotional resolution between us. Appropriate emphasis on public safety considerations rather than personal reconciliation. When asked directly about my position regarding release, I offered the carefully considered response developed through consultation with my support network. I neither oppose nor advocate for specific release timing. I believe Richard has demonstrated significant rehabilitation, suggesting reduced risk, while acknowledging that continued structured oversight remains appropriate during community reintegration. Whatever your decision, I request that release conditions include ongoing therapeutic support, financial transparency requirements, and graduated contact with family members, including continued supervision during initial interactions with my grandchildren. These specific conditions reflected balanced approach to potential release, neither blanket opposition nor unqualified support, but practical framework prioritizing both public safety and family well-being through appropriate transition structures. The emphasis on continued accountability mechanisms rather than permanent exclusion demonstrated forward-looking perspective focused on rehabilitation outcomes rather than punitive continuation. Richard was permitted to respond to my statement, his measured words revealing continuing evolution in his understanding. My mother's assessment is more generous than I deserve, he acknowledged without performative self-flagellation. The work I've completed here represents beginning rather than completion of necessary change. If granted conditional release, I understand the requirement for continuing oversight and accountability structures that protect both public safety and family well-being while demonstrating sustained behavioral change beyond institutional environments. This recognition of rehabilitation as ongoing process rather than accomplished status indicated realistic self-assessment essential for sustained change. The acknowledgement of continuing accountability requirements rather than expectation of immediate trust demonstrated appropriate understanding of harm's lasting impact on relationship foundations. Following standard procedures, we would not receive the parole board's decision immediately. The 2-week waiting period provided opportunity for continued reflection about potential outcomes and necessary adjustments regardless of their determination. Catherine helped me understand practical implications of different scenarios, ensuring preparation for either continued incarceration or structured release with appropriate conditions. During this waiting period, an unexpected development created additional complexity in an already challenging situation. Charlotte, still serving her longer sentence in a different facility, attempted to insert herself into the release consideration process by sending letters to both the parole board and my attorney containing new allegations about Richard's supposed hidden assets and claimed continuing risk factors. The transparent attempt to sabotage Richard's potential release revealed continuing manipulation, even from within correctional constraints. Catherine's assessment after reviewing the materials found no credible new information, only deliberate distortions apparently motivated by Charlotte's realization that Richard might achieve earlier release while she remained incarcerated for the longer term. This appears to be purely vindictive rather than protective, Catherine observed after consulting with the prosecutor who had handled Charlotte's case. She's attempting to maintain control even from current limitations by disrupting his potential progress. The parole board has experience recognizing this dynamic in domestic cases and will evaluate her claims with appropriate skepticism. The situation highlighted Charlotte's continuing capacity for manipulation despite institutional constraints, a sobering reminder of how deeply ingrained exploitative patterns remain, even without access to previous resources or relationships. The prosecutor assured Catherine that Charlotte's communication would be appropriately contextualized within her established pattern of strategic deception, rather than treated as credible new evidence. When the parole board's decision finally arrived, it reflected careful consideration of rehabilitation evidence while maintaining appropriate caution about community reintegration. Richard was granted conditional release with substantial oversight requirements, including residence in a transitional facility for 6 months before independent housing regular meetings with both parole officers and therapeutic providers, complete financial transparency with monitoring of all accounts and transactions, graduated supervised contact with family members beginning with structured settings, restricted geographic movement within the county, with permission required for travel, electronic monitoring during initial reintegration period. The conditions balanced recognition of rehabilitation progress with ongoing accountability structures designed to both verify sustained behavioral change and provide support during challenging transition from institutional to community environments. The decision acknowledged positive indicators while maintaining protective mechanisms appropriate to offense severity and complexity. My reaction to this outcome reflected the complicated reality of family harm, neither uncomplicated relief nor unmitigated concern, but complex integration of multiple valid considerations. Richard's rehabilitation appeared genuine based on observable indicators, yet appropriate caution about sustained change outside institutional structures remained necessary for everyone's well-being. The foundation I had established had developed protocols for exactly this circumstance, supporting families navigating reintegration after exploitation or harm by providing both practical guidance and emotional support during complex transitions. The organization would now serve my own family's needs through structured reintegration planning with professional facilitation of graduated family reconnection. 7 years after switching those water glasses at my dining room table, I stood in the community garden of the senior living complex where I now served as resident advocate and security consultant. My 79th birthday had passed the previous week, celebrated with a gathering that would have seemed impossible in the aftermath of Richard's arrest. My grandchildren, now 16 and 13, several close friends including Margaret and Dr. Lewis Catherine and her family, and most remarkably Richard himself, now 18. My father's medical training inadvertently prepared me to trust patterns. Even when individual incidents seemed explainable, I responded sharing the foundational wisdom that had ultimately saved my life. He taught me that diagnosis requires integrating seemingly unrelated observations rather than dismissing inconsistencies. That approach revealed concerning patterns in behavior that might individually seem innocent but collectively indicated systematic problems. The interview progressed through carefully sequenced topics, early warning signs, documentation methods, support network development, and legal protections that had enabled both justice and eventual healing. Throughout this portion, Richard remained offstage, participating only after exploration of exploitation dynamics had been thoroughly established for viewers. When he joined for the rehabilitation and reconciliation segment, the physical transformation from his pre-arrest appearance remained striking. Gone was both the entitled executive persona and the institutional diminishment of early incarceration, replaced by someone whose presence reflected hard-earned self-awareness rather than performance or pretense. Richard, you've completed multiple rehabilitation programs focusing on exploitation dynamics and accountability, the interviewer noted. What represented the most significant shift in your understanding of your actions and their impact? His measured response reflected genuine integration rather than rehearsed talking points. The most fundamental change came through recognizing that explanations, financial pressure, manipulation by my wife, emotional vulnerabilities never constitute justification, he explained. Understanding factors that influenced my decisions provides context for prevention, but never diminishes responsibility for choices made within those circumstances. This distinction between contextual understanding and responsibility avoidance represented the essential foundation upon which limited family reintegration had become possible. Without this fundamental recognition, no amount of supervised interaction or practical accountability measures would have created sufficient safety for continued connection. When asked about our current relationship, I provided the balanced perspective developed through years of careful navigation. We've established what I would call a respectfully limited relationship, I explained. Contact occurs within appropriate boundaries that acknowledge both meaningful rehabilitation and the permanent impact of previous actions. Trust isn't assumed, but evaluated through consistent demonstration over time within structured interactions. This realistic approach, neither performance of uncomplicated forgiveness nor permanent exclusion, regardless of demonstrated change, reflected the complex reality of family reconciliation after profound harm. The nuanced truth served educational purposes better than either simplistic narrative of easy redemption or irreversible condemnation. The most powerful segment came when the interviewer addressed the question many viewers would naturally consider. Mrs. Winters, how do you reconcile maintaining any relationship with someone who attempted to such profound harm? The question deserved the thoughtful response it had taken years to develop through both personal experience and professional consultation. Reconciliation doesn't mean erasing history or pretending harm didn't occur, I explained. It means creating new relationship foundations based on current reality rather than previous expectations. The relationship we've established acknowledges both the son I raised and loved and the person capable of calculated harm, holding these contradictory truths simultaneously without allowing either to negate the other. Richard's response to the same question demonstrated parallel understanding developed through years of therapeutic work. I recognize that maintaining any connection represents extraordinary generosity rather than obligation, he acknowledged. The structured relationship we've established prioritizes my mother's safety and well-being rather than my desire for forgiveness or normalization. Accepting appropriate limitations represents minimal accountability for actions that might reasonably have resulted in permanent separation. The interview concluded with exploration of the Foundation's work protecting vulnerable seniors through both direct services and policy advocacy. This transition from personal experience to structural response highlighted the transformation of individual trauma into meaningful systemic change, creating protection for those without the awareness or resources that had enabled my own survival. As the production team packed equipment and prepared to leave, the journalist offered a final observation that captured something essential about our unusual family journey. What strikes me most isn't the harm or even the partial healing, she noted. It's the remarkable capacity to hold complexity without surrendering to simplistic narratives. Most people seek comfortable certainty by denying either the possibility of meaningful change or the permanent impact of serious harm. Your family demonstrates the courage to acknowledge both simultaneously. This recognition of the difficult middle path we had chosen, neither toxic forgiveness that minimized harm, nor permanent condemnation that denied transformation possibility, reflected the fundamental wisdom that had guided every stage of our journey. The capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously had provided foundation for both justice and measured healing without sacrificing either to comfortable simplification. The weeks following the interview brought unexpected developments that further demonstrated the ongoing nature of recovery and reconciliation. My grandchildren, after watching the broadcast with support from their therapist, initiated deeper conversations about their understanding of family history and its impact on their developing identities. I used to worry that I might somehow have inherited whatever made Dad capable of hurting you. My grandson confided during one of our regular weekend visits. Watching him take responsibility without excuses actually helped me understand that his actions came from choices, not some inevitable family flaw I might carry. This profound insight from a 16-year-old demonstrated the remarkable resilience children can develop when provided honest, age-appropriate understanding rather than protective deception. The transparency about difficult realities had allowed him to process complex family history without internalizing it as predetermined destiny, perhaps the most significant healing outcome across generations. Richard's participation in the interview had additional consequences within the correctional system, where he continued regular reporting and therapeutic requirements. His parole officer noted that the public accountability demonstrated through the broadcast had influenced assessment of his rehabilitation progress, potentially accelerating timeline considerations for reducing certain supervision requirements. The willingness to acknowledge harmful actions in public forum without qualification or minimization represents significant indicator of sustained change, the officer explained during our regular communication about Richard's supervision parameters. This doesn't eliminate continued verification requirements, but it does provide meaningful evidence beyond institutional compliance. My own journey continued evolving through unexpected pathways. The interview had generated increased attention to elder exploitation issues, creating opportunities for the Foundation to expand educational programs and advocacy initiatives. What had begun as personal protection response had developed into sustained structural change, benefiting countless vulnerable seniors beyond my individual experience. Perhaps most meaningful was the letter I received from a 68-year-old woman who had recognized her own situation while watching our interview. "I've been dismissing warning signs about my daughter's increasing control over my finances," she wrote. "Your story gave me permission to trust my concerns rather than dismissing them as paranoia or disloyalty. I've implemented several protection measures and connected with your foundation's local support network. This tangible impact potential tragedy, averted through awareness created from my own experience, provided profound meaning beyond personal healing. The transformation of individual trauma into protective wisdom for others represented the most significant resolution possible from circumstances no one would willingly choose, but many are forced to navigate. As I approach my 80th birthday, I've come to recognize that healing from profound betrayal isn't about reaching perfect resolution or comfortable certainty. It's about developing capacity to hold life's most challenging contradictions, that those closest to us can cause deepest harm. That understanding influences doesn't eliminate responsibility for choices, that accountability and transformation can coexist within appropriate boundaries, and that meaningful healing requires neither toxic forgiveness nor permanent condemnation. The water glass I switched that evening 7 years ago represented both the moment betrayal was revealed and the beginning of a journey toward truth that transcended simple narratives. The wisdom that emerged through this unwanted but necessary path now serves not just my personal healing, but protection for countless others facing similar circumstances without adequate awareness or resources. If this story has helped you recognize warning signs in your own relationships or provided perspective on navigating complex family harm, please share it with others who might benefit from understanding that protection doesn't require choosing between awareness and compassion. The most powerful truth emerges from holding both, simultaneously remaining alert to potential harm while maintaining capacity for recognizing genuine transformation when it occurs. Thank you for following this difficult journey through its many unexpected turns. My hope is that sharing these experiences provides not just engaging narrative, but practical wisdom for anyone facing the complicated reality of loving someone capable of causing harm while protecting yourself from exploitation disguised as family connection.